Now it is time to begin session 2. Ikeda-san, over to you.
Okay, hello everyone. On the next session, we will discuss about risk management using technology. My name is Yuichi Ikeda, and I am a partner in PwC Japan's leading forensic service, focusing on forensic technology, and I'll be moderating this session. So first, I'd like to introduce the panelists for today's session. Vince, can you introduce yourself using a couple minutes each?
Oh, sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Vince Walden. I'm CEO of Kona AI. We are a data-driven compliance and anti-fraud transaction monitoring technology and platform. We help companies, whether on-prem or through our hosted cloud, do a lot of the transaction monitoring to detect improper payments, anti-corruption, sanctions, trade compliance, and fraud type risks. As background, I was a Big Four consultant most of my life, a partner for about 10 years. And what I saw in the kind of manual process of what we would do around anti-corruption, it was really great it was a great opportunity to use technology and artificial intelligence to help automate many of the traditional processes that were manually done. And we've seen a lot of exciting and new innovations come out of it. So that's my quick background. Over to you.
Eric Robinson. I am with Kale Discovery and our Global Advisory Services organization. I've been in and around client data issues for the better part of 25 years. I'm a non-practicing lawyer, so working with clients to respond to requests from folks like Matt, who will introduce himself in a minute. But where we focus is working with clients to actually figure out how to better manage their data, whether they're actually in an active investigation or in an effort to have them have better data hygiene, in advance, so that they can approach in a more effective, defensible way.
Hi, everyone. Cliff Lam from Alex Partners. We're a global business consulting firm. My focus areas is white-collar crime investigation and financial crime compliance. I'm a forensic accountant by practice, trained in a Big Four accounting firm. Then I moved into an international risk consulting firm and got very lucky to get into the compliance world, working on some very big corporate monitorship for HSBC, and also get a chance to work on some high-profile investigation in Brazil in relation to the Lava Jato investigation. Then I moved in-house into Standard Chartered Bank, heading up the regional fraud risk management, also covering Japan, Korea, and Greater China, where I set up the digital fraud detection program for the bank before I come back to consulting to Alex Partners, now focus on investigation compliance.
Hi, and I'm Matt Galvin. I'm very sorry to disappoint you. I am, as of Friday, no longer with the U.S. Department of Justice. And you can tell because I have no script in front of me. I'm just speaking directly.
Wait, no disclaimer, Matt? What?
Exactly. The views I have are somewhat dangerous and could be completely unfounded. But while I was with the Department of Justice, I had two jobs. One was to evaluate corporate compliance programs and set the policy, and we talked a lot about the evaluation of corporate compliance policy this morning, and kind of draft and lead the working groups on that policy. And the other was to design and implement the technological tools that we would use to detect white-collar crime and assist in investigations throughout the department. I'm currently a co-founder of Gentic Global Advisors, which is a boutique consultancy that helps either use ways to use technology to promote corporate compliance or ways to manage the ethical risks of new technology. Before I was at the department, I was the Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer for AB InBev, which is a very large company in almost every market except Japan. But 1 in 3 beers in the world are an AB InBev product. And so I manage the risk of a Fortune 100 operation with 180,000 employees operating in 60 countries before I went to the department.
Great, thank you guys. So let's get into the discussion, and let me set the stage for the session. So we all know that the technology plays a critical role in the risk management these days, and in other words, it is probably impossible to manage risks effectively and efficiently without using technology. So I was in the legal technology event in New York last week, right? Last week, and actually everybody except for Cliff were in the event, and it was actually not my fault that you didn't make it. But so there are a lot of technology which is related to the legal compliance or the investigations and everything, and some of the technology looks very promising and then it looks very effective, but some are maybe questionable. And a lot of people are looking for the good technology that they can utilize in their business to achieve their goals, like whether it's compliance or investigation. And last couple of years, like I noticed that AI is basically everywhere. I mean, probably every tool has it, right? So it made us even feel like it is wrong not to have AI in the tool that we use. So we have 4 experts today, and we will discuss about risk management from 4 different aspects, which is risk assessment and data analytics, which is implementation, monitoring, and detection, and 3, investigation, and 4, review and remediation. So we will start from a risk management topic. Risk assessment topic, and myself as a practitioner, we get the same question all the time. Like, client says we want to make our compliance program better, but we don't know where we should start from, you know. And or we want to use technology or this new technology to make our compliance program more effective and efficient, but we don't know who to consult with. So question from especially from Japanese clients is more like, does the technology really work in the compliance? And some companies might have some ideas where they want to start from because they have very specific concerns or ongoing issue that they want to take care, or some companies took a big loss from the specific misconduct in the past. But majority of people know that they need to do something or they should do something, but they simply don't know where exactly they should start from. And this might sound like a textbook answer, but it is definitely a risk assessment to basically understand where the risks are. So Eric, can you give us some of the key points people should keep in mind when they conduct risk assessment, probably from a technical aspect?
Well, to start with, and probably one of the most critical elements is that there's no easy button. So there's no quick and easy way to just do it. And there's no one size fits all. So anytime you're entering into this process, and in the first panel today, there was a lot of conversation about the fact that if you don't have a program in place and you're starting from scratch with a risk assessment, it is a big lift. There's a lot of work, a lot of effort that has to go into establishing, what your risk assessment parameters are, because every organization is different. You have to play to the culture, you have to play to the business you're in, where you're doing business, who you're doing business with, and lots of other elements. All of that comes back to is that you then have to fit your technology to your organization. There are lots of technologies out there, and the reality is that they're not all created equal. And you have to figure out what it is you need to achieve with your compliance program and what you're trying to accomplish with your risk assessments. The other thing that I think is really important to understand is that while we're focusing on compliance here today, is that risk assessments actually go beyond just your compliance program. And what you do with risk assessments actually can lay a foundation for how you approach your data and how you approach what your organization is doing, both from a business perspective, in who you're dealing with, how you're dealing with it. I'll short circuit that to say understanding your data is critical to understanding how you need to manage your data. Like what data you have, what regulations are you subject to? That also goes into understanding what technologies to use, what types of surveillance and identification tools are available. The other thing that I want to focus on, that I want to mention and stress as well, is that AI is not new to this arena. AI has become a very generic term. What's new is the use of what I would refer to as advanced artificial intelligence and the generative AI tools. Artificial intelligence, machine learning has been around for more than a decade. You can actually go back to the 1950s. But from a business perspective, we've been using AI for the better part of 15 years, in a meaningful way in business. So these are all elements that have to come into play with this. And in part of the risk assessment is information collection to identify your risks. And this, again, ties back to understanding your organization, understanding your data, and developing protocols, which is something that I think Cliff is going to touch on as well, is risk scoring and risk mapping, right? Understanding what things you're doing or what data you have creates greater risk, and in combination, how do those combinations actually enhance or mitigate risk? And I'll come back to one other thing that the first panel said. There was a lot of great points from that first panel today. But one thing is that when you're developing these programs, risk assessment is one component of a compliance program. What's critical here is having a risk assessment program as part of your compliance program, documenting what it is and how it's being done, tracking it, and then educating the workforce on it. If you miss any of those steps, you're undermining the defensibility of that program. So the reasonableness of your program starts to fall apart if you're not creating a holistic solution as part of your greater compliance program. I could probably go on for the whole hour, but I'm going to stop and turn it back over to you.
Can I make one quick comment on when I think about risk assessment too? And again, the audience, if compliance professionals here, but if you are an SEC registrant or if you're traded on and through a U.S. stock exchange, you probably comply with the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, which means you do have a risk assessment already done. It's called an enterprise risk assessment, and your internal audit leads it. It's part of a SOX requirement. Otherwise, you wouldn't have an opinion on your Sarbanes-Oxley. So most companies do have a risk assessment, but it's that enterprise perspective. And oftentimes, I call it not getting invited to the party. Sometimes, and hopefully this is not you, but the fraud risks or compliance or sanctions, a lot of the legal risks don't seem to make their way into an enterprise risk assessment. But if you're in compliance going, where do I start with my risk assessment? And you're traded on a U.S., if Sarbanes-Oxley applies to your company, which you should know because you're in compliance, go ask someone for the enterprise risk assessment and maybe just start there because they'll have the heat maps and a lot of the frameworks to look at. But then you need to inject your expertise around it.
And I think that's a great point. I mean, because it's one thing to have a program and a policy. It's another thing to be able to implement it. True. So getting from the piece of paper to actually putting that into action. So the operationalizing those elements in a defensible, efficient way are critical to this process, because the policy or the program itself on paper is not going to be a defense, as we learned earlier today. You're not going to be able to say, here's my program, here's my policy, so we're okay, we've been reasonable. If you haven't implemented in a meaningful, realistic, reasonable way, then you could have the greatest program on earth on paper, but you're never going to be able to rely on it from a defensibility perspective. And that's where having consultants, whether they're internal or external, becomes a critical element in understanding where you need to comply and how your data and not only how your data applies, but how your organization is operating, and be able to, when you take your policy, create processes and protocols that actually allow you to enforce it.
And I would add, so in my vantage of kind of reviewing dozens of compliance programs, a lot of times where companies went wrong on the risk assessment was that, well, it's true, everything my colleague said, is they only focused on the risk. You should also look at the capabilities of an organization. What does it do uniquely well that offsets risk? Much like if you have very strong arms, you might have weak legs, and you have to think about what you need to manage. So for example, when I was at AB InBev, a fast-moving consumer goods company, very good at marketing, right? You could take, beer, hops, water, and market it, to everyone. And so I thought a lot about what was the brand of my compliance program. To compete in a market of ideas that's an organization, I had to be good at branding and promoting my compliance program. AB InBev was also very analytical. People had 5 targets every year that were data-driven targets that would measure performance and how they were compensated. So my compliance program had to be very analytical. It had to be very data-driven. That would have certain data-focused targets on what people would do to achieve their compliance goals and move. So my compliance incentives had to align with the incentives and structures of my corporation. And yeah, that's risk, but there's the assets of the company that comes with it that mitigates it. And I think about when I study like great Japanese, ways of working in business, and I've always emulated the Toyota way, that everyone on the line would raise issues to optimize a line. That to me is compliance. That's speak-up culture. That's raising concerns to optimize a business function and manage risk. And so in this market, as you think about optimizing your compliance program, you should very much think of your assets. The other piece of it that's, I think, very important for this discussion, and I think one of the least understood but most important changes that we put in the ECCP in the fall was a concept of proportionality. What does your compliance program have in terms of technology and resources in relation to the rest of the business? Now, I guarantee you, for the legal and compliance people in the room, in almost all cases, you probably have the worst technology in the business, right? So you should look outside. What technological assets can you leverage? Again, it's very related to the concept of what assets does the corporation have to manage risk? And if the business is very effectively using generative AI or unsupervised learning or visualization or kind of third-party logistics or blockchain, you should think about how to incorporate the parts of your program that are existing and thriving in the business. All those little increments that are improving supply chain can easily be repurposed to improve your compliance program as well. And I think that's critically important to think of as you evaluate the technology. You don't need to go always out to get technology. You can leverage the huge assets that you have within and make great change.
Sure.
And just two data points. I think that when we build a risk assessment program, one of the things we really need to think about is to try to find. I come from investigation background, so a lot of time when I start with the risk assessment, really looking at where's the leakage, where do we lose the money, and a lot of time when we actually don't have that risk assessment process in the first place, the loss data doesn't exist. So the first step is really get to know how much we lost, so that we come up with the quantity, the quantum that you can communicate with the management. Another part is in the first sessions, we talk about the risk assessment, the key risk. What is the definition of key risk? What is the threshold that the organization really care about in terms of financial impact and non-financial impacts? These are the very important definition, because if the definition is not well defined, what is key, then we may spend a lot of time in identifying those minor risks, but not really addressing a key risk.
One additional question, probably to Matt. So by looking at the Fortune, for example, Fortune 500 companies, I know that we talk about what's the sort of the ideal situation about managing risks or keeping the maintaining the good compliance program, but how many percent or like of the for example Fortune 500 companies are you think you consider that has the adequate level of the compliance program and the level of maintenance? I'm curious,
Well, I mean, you have to think of the very biased sample size of companies that are under investigation reporting to the Department of Justice. And so in that case, it would tilt to the ones that have very robust compliance programs tend not to be in that situation. Because the goal of a compliance program, I mean, you're managing humans, and humans are imperfect. So your organizations are fraught with imperfect humans. And so once you kind of come to terms with that, the goal of a compliance program is to get signal of where their deviant behavior early. And in the panel this morning talked about kind of investigative patterns within a company. Critically, you should be looking at the magnitude of certain issues. Because when you kind of do an analysis of where you would see a company, right? Companies that have no compliance program have no problems. Then they have one big one, and it's a crisis. And then you start looking, and you see 2 to 3 more. And then you start to do root cause and build out programs. And what happens is more mature compliance programs, you tend to have a yield curve of your kind of investigative portfolio of a high number of low magnitude issues spread evenly throughout the company. And it will look a little bit depending on the market you're in and a little bit depending on what the business you're in. But the goal of compliance is to find issues early, manage them before they metastasize into much bigger problems. And so the companies that I'm looking at from a DOJ failed, right? Their problems metastasized into something bigger. Now, what happens is I'm often looking at a compliance program 3 or 4 years, just in the investigative life cycle, after that happened. And so they've put things in the yield curves, if they're thinking along those analytical, like if they're really trying to measure effectiveness, they're talking in terms of outcomes of performance, outcomes of behavior, measurable kind of observable patterns within your kind of organizational kind of constellation. And so that's something that I would certainly look for. The other thing that I think is really important to think about when you're assessing kind of the technology and where you're investing in this space is when I was kind of redoing and coming up with a strategy for how the department would invest in technology, we wanted to do 3 things better. I wanted to manage internal knowledge better. So if I had an investigation here, I could understand what was happening here, and if we had historical issues with this person and they moved, I could see it here. Much in the same way at AB InBev, I could track patterns throughout the company. The second is I wanted to get much smarter about how data that we acquired from companies in the context of investigation would be used. And so use AI to parse evidence. How can you quickly get signal with limited resources to find what's relevant to your investigation? And the tools to that are getting very good, whether it's in unstructured data, whether it's in forensic accounting and algorithmic pattern analysis of where you might have slush funds or money leaving in a way that's a control issue. So that was the second part of the strategy. The third and equally important part, and where I see very few companies good at, is external risks. What data is external to the company? Because if you think, someone like me, or very sophisticated investigative journalists, are looking to see what data exists around an industry that's high risk for behavior. And what insights can I get, whether it's, there's loads of government procurement transparency initiatives around the world that I could tap and see where government was spending money. And I could see kind of cartel or corrupt indicators across government procurement initiatives that had nothing to do with the United States, or certainly within the United States. I could see extractive indices of where contracts were going for certain natural resources. I could triangulate in strategically important resources where there was a huge amount of competition to get and see if there was foul play involved in where there was also a transparency initiative. And so as different pots of data becomes available, and as you think of the revolution that's happening technologically wise, is the ability to synthesize huge amounts of unstructured data to get signal. That's game changing for risk. And so as you think about your program of where you want to place your bets, right? How is your internal knowledge management? Can you identify problems internally? How are you ready for an investigation? If you were going to simulate the technology that I might use, can you stay ahead of me? And then thirdly, are you managing external data well? At least well enough that your external stakeholders, if you're an industry where people will care and there's transparency initiatives around you, what can people know about you from looking from the outside in? And I don't know if I can think of any company that does all three of those things perfectly. But I'm sure if they were, I would never have seen them in the Department of Justice.
Yeah, and I'm going to take a slightly different take on your question, because as someone who's often seen this after there's been an issue, that there are many companies, Fortune 100, Fortune 500 companies, that believe they have very effective programs in place until they learn that they don't. So there's a false level of confidence in what they've done, because they're otherwise very sophisticated organizations in many, many ways. But and I've seen this true on a global scale. This is not just U.S. companies or European companies or Japanese companies. This is true globally, that many organizations have a false level of confidence in what they've created because it hasn't been tested. It's once it's been tested and they've realized that there's a hole, that they have that take me to the mountain moment, and have to reevaluate how they're managing and how they've created their programs, and then once they get through this this crisis moment, is figure out how they now build a effective, defensible program that doesn't have those holes. And it's never going to be perfect. I'm a firm believer that perfection is an aspiration, and we're always working towards it, but there's always going to be something, whether it's technology changing, regulations changing, politics changing, that are going to impact how these programs are developed, how they're enforced, how they're managed, and then how the regulators are then perceiving them. So it's an ongoing, cyclical, iterative process. But I do believe that any organization that says, we're good, we've done this, we've got the perfect program in place, is a disaster waiting to happen. Because it comes back to the other conversation from earlier today, is you have to revisit these programs because the environment around you is not static. So if any one thing changes, it can dramatically impact the program you created to meet what the prior circumstances were. So it's, again, being dynamic in this process, I think, is critical, and avoiding that sense of false security.
Thank you. So, gotta move on to the next topic. So, I'm gonna talk about the data analytics implementation, monitoring, and detection. Vince, can you tell us about using the data analytics in a compliance program, and what's the importance to keep in mind when designing the monitoring by using data analytics?
Well, I'll tell you, now is a very exciting time to be in compliance. Even especially, well, again, in the U.S., we're seeing a lot of enforcement is going down, perhaps, but then questions are being raised by the companies. Do we still need a compliance program? Of course you do, and that's not going down. But what's interesting is when I look at the market and what's happening, technology, and perhaps it's with generative AI and the AI buzz that's happening, if you look at the compliance programs over the last 10, 15 years, and think about your program, we've had a highly regulatory enforcement government generally across the globe over the last 10 to 15 years. And if you look at your compliance programs, you've got layer after layer after layer of more people, more processes, maybe a little technology, but more people and more people and more people and a little bit more process every single year. The average Fortune 500 company is spending $5 to $10 million on third-party due diligence, which you gotta have, right? Now, if you're the CFO of a company who controls the purse strings and the budgets of compliance and general counsels and everything, does due diligence really get you more sales? Do the customers care about? Now, you gotta know who you're doing business with, but where does the fraud happen? Let me ask everybody in the room. Does fraud and corruption and sanctions and trade compliance, does it happen during the due diligence? Now, you need to do it. I'm not bagging on due diligence. But does fraud happen during due diligence, or when you actually exchange money with the third party and do business? It happens in the latter part. Yet all of compliance, I would say, or most compliance, spends all their time and resources on due diligence. Why? Because lawyers and attorneys love words. They don't like accounting, otherwise they would have been accountants, but they like words. A good program, and you think about what Matt did at AB InBev and BrewRight, yes, it had a great due diligence program, but it was transaction monitoring, and that's where a lot of the savings and benefits and where it lies. So I just ask yourself, if you've got 10, 20, 30 people lined up reviewing due diligence checks, AI is a great opportunity for you. Take a look at it. There's a lot of processes that, again, over the last 15 years have been layered upon layered. When compliance uses fear, which means regulatory enforcement, and again, it was interesting, I loved this first panel session topics, but it was still fear-based. It was still the regulators are your stakeholders. You got to do this for the regulators. I say, do this for your CFO. Do this for the business. Everybody else in the business, the C-level executives, have to come in with numbers, not fear, but statistics and figures as to why the business needs to be improved. I say compliance, come in there with statistics and figures and a data-driven compliance program that will please the regulators, of course, but also please the CFO who controls your budget. Regulators don't control your budget, the CFO does. So think about that from your perspective, and that's where data-driven compliance comes in. And I'll just conclude with this last thought. Where do you start? Going back to the risk assessment, it's huge. Don't do analytics on something that doesn't matter just because you did it last year. T&E, okay, great. We're going to find a couple taxi cabs and a couple of spends. Maybe. Again, you got to do it, but that's not where the risk is. Do your risk assessment. Talk to people, talk to the business, etc. And interestingly, you'll find if you just take where to start your analytics program, from your highest risk areas, just ask the question, what data sources would give us transparency into that risk? Ask someone in IT, and your compliance people won't know the answer. The IT and the business people will know the answer. That sounds like a risky area. What data would we need to get transparency into that? And then go get that data and test it, build a dashboard, and then you have a monitoring that's going to be a wow factor because it's really hitting a high-risk area. That's how you start it. It's funny, people ask me, hey, Kona AI, you're an AI company. No, I'm not. I'm not an AI company. I'm a compliance and technology solution that uses AI. I'm not an AI company. I use AI for machine learning and what happened to make that review and finding improper payments easier. But don't just think about this as an AI. Think about this as, what's my risk? Map the data to the risk, and then bring transparency to that risk via data, and you'll find that your return on investment and your budget will increase, especially in these times where CFOs, well, I don't want to talk, I'll generalize in the US perhaps, but my guess, and the attorneys that I speak with, if a US Fortune 500 company comes to the CFO and says, I need to increase my budget by 20%, and he's going to go, Trump and the regulatory environment, and DOJ just had these huge layoffs, why do I need to have that? I would expect to say, look, I want to have this, I need budget for something, but I'm also reassessing these process, and I'm going to save 20% off my budget because I'm going to do more with less, I'm going to do more using technology with less human power. And I don't need those 30 people offshore anymore. I need 10 or what have you. So again, I'm on my soapbox here, but those are some of the things where technology can be applied to save money and some things to think about.
If I can give two examples from my time in-house that might be relevant. I mean, to me, technology creates so many opportunities to kind of remove all the really boring parts of compliance. But it also gives lawyers and compliance professionals the ability to do math without knowing any math. So as I had to justify the AB InBev program, which BrewRight was a series of 15 different interconnected dashboards, some of which were fully kind of unsupervised learning AI to predict risk, some of which were baseline rule-based testing. But I had a constellation. I could see risk across the globe, and I could see it in all my operations across from about 70 different data sources. And I could see behavior, and I could measure what we did. But I didn't start there. I started, and I had to justify things very slowly. One was in investigation costs.
I remember when I first started, I was head of investigations for AB InBev, and I inherited this investigation. It was a couple different countries, and worried about agents interfacing with international sport. And it looked like almost every other investigation that I had done for years as a lawyer. We would have meetings with folks in New York and Washington, and then we'd talk to the people on the ground in the countries, and we'd talk about the data. And then they'd spend 6 weeks, and they'd get it, and they'd process it, and they'd bring it. Then we'd have another meeting, all of which were paying by the hour, going, everything you don't want to do as an in-house lawyer, driving off cost expenses. And so eventually we got to the bottom of the investigation, and it took about 1.5 years. A year later, I had built a system that I already had the data. And we had a $100 billion acquisition, and the company that we acquired had the same issue in 6 different countries. Instead of replicating that very inefficient process, I could quickly see here, I could hire an investigator and say, who do I really care about in these 6 countries? And they could tell me, here are the entities and their relations. I could look immediately at every payment to them with a statistical probability of whether that payment was risky or not. And we quickly triangulated the 3 cases that we needed to do. It was 1/3 the time and 1/7 of the cost to do the investigation. And that was my presentation to the board after year 1. And I got budget to do year 2. As it evolved, I had arrangements with CFOs around the business. Because I was doing transaction testing and I was intercepting, when you're looking for corruption in kind of slush funds, you're looking for fraud too, because it's just really, a slush fund in relation to the government is what kind of corruption is, as opposed to fraud. And as you all, investigators will tell you, in most corruption cases, people are stealing too, right? And sometimes they give it to their friend. It can kind of go both ways. And so it looks the same when you're doing kind of advanced algorithmic calculus across your ERP system network. So when you look at the money, you can see corruption and fraud the same way. So we stopped a lot of fraud. And so when I presented that to CFOs, I would get credit for half to my budget for the next year, which is how I got budget for 4, 5, and 6, and how we kind of approached becoming an entirely revenue neutral compliance program, which should be the goal. You shouldn't be a cost center. You should be a value driver. And you become a value driver, and to show that, you show that with math. And the beautiful thing about analytics is it allows you to access math without knowing any math.
DOJ is also revenue neutral, isn't it? Or actually probably revenue
The
generated.
FCPA was very revenue positive for the United States government.
Just to take it back to technology for a moment, and because we've touched on it, is again, AI is the buzzword across the board in every vertical, every industry, every sense of technology. The reality is, and Vince and I were talking about this morning, is that not all AI tools are created equal, and there is such a thing as building too complex a solution, right? Building more, doing more than what needs to be done for the problem at hand. So, for example, in transactional detection, maybe you don't need a $1 million or a $10 million generative AI tool. You're leveraging AI, machine learning, other deep analytics to accomplish what you need for that type of detection. So I find this a lot with clients and prospective clients, that they're immediately saying, well, we need all this new technology. The reality is that the technologies, the machine learning, in many instances, particularly in this particular arena, is more than sufficient to get to what we need. The type of analytics that Matt's talking about, it's done almost, correct me if I'm wrong, almost exclusively with machine learning, other types of deep analytics, less from a generative solution.
We used neural networks and unsupervised learning, but this was, when I was, I wasn't doing this. This was before governments, was 4 years ago.
Right. But it's fitting the solution to the problem, right? If you need generative AI, then by all means, find tools that leverage that. If you don't, then don't overcomplicate the solutions.
Okay, moving on to the next topic, investigation. So this is a quote from ECCP. So DOJ says, one of the hallmark of an effective compliance program is the existence of a well-functioning and appropriately funded mechanism for the timely and thorough investigation of any allegation or suspicion of misconduct by the company, its employees, or agents. Cliff, can you tell us about how the investigation is designed and conducted when a company has an issue?
Sure. I think investigation is just different type of investigation, or probably just divided into two type, right? The first type is more like ad hoc, the regular investigation. It can be regulatory investigations or whistleblower triggered investigations. So let's call them ad hoc investigations, right? When we deal with this type of investigation, under this type of a setting, the independence of the investigation there's a lot of emphasis on the independence as well as the data integrity and the completeness, because if you think about dealing with investigations, the first thing you need to think about is who is going to read the investigation report, right? If the regulator will have access to the investigation findings, or the external auditors will challenge your investigation findings, then you want to make sure that you have a pretty good position to defend your investigation scope and your approach. Now, when we talk about data, I think we just now we always mentioned this is unstructured data and structured data. In terms of the unstructured data, it all depends on how you scope your investigation, but obviously you will have a set of custodians or employees that you want to investigate, and you want to find out what communication do they have, what type of documents do they have on their computers, on their mobile phones, or even server emails, their share drive, share folders. And when you collect it, and this is a bread and butter in investigation, when you collect it, you want to make sure that it's forensically sound so that you can defend the integrity of the data. And because the whole investigation is so closely looked at by external party, you need to take additional procedures. We're not talking about some very sophisticated technology, AI or Gen AI. We're talking about additional technical steps to ensure that you look at your data, ensure that the data are not compromised, that deleted files are identified, recovered. You're looking at the communication data to see whether there's a potential gap in between that may indicate certain red flag in your investigation. Now, technology has been developing, and I think in the past few years, especially with the Gen AI, there's a lot of behavior change in terms of technology adoption. One of the key things I see is the use of machine learning in reviewing documents, right? In the past, we call it technology assisted review, TAR. When you talk about TAR, a lot of lawyers or clients would, well, maybe you should review audited documents. But in recent years, you see that when the rise of AI with the machine learning, people are more receptive to the idea of using machine learning. The machine learning help you to risk rating or your documents. So that really help you to prioritize your review. That cut down, in my experience, it cut down 1 to 2 months of review to 1 to 2 weeks, which is very significant. And other use case on the unstructured data is on the pre-case assessment. We do it all the time, especially when you load the electronic communication data to a platform. It helps you visualize the communication traffic between the individuals so that you know how close they're communicating, how close in terms of their relationship dynamic, and it allows you to instantly dive into the communication traffic and try to understand what they talk about, right? What type of topic they discussed. And that actually helped us to really focus on the key topic, key search term that we want to have a deep dive review. So there's a couple of the technology around. There's also structured data we will touch on during the investigation. These are typical transaction data, but I think I probably won't go into how we collect those data. But again, a lot of step we need to put in because the data reconciliation, the completeness of data is still a focus of the external party. Now, in terms of the this type of ad hoc investigation, I would say that I don't think there's a lot of AI will go into play in this area. We still a lot of time we're still using SQL or Python for this type of structured data analytics, but this is more an ad hoc investigation. But now, if you work for financial institutions, that's a completely different story. A lot of regular standardized investigations like AML investigation, credit card fraud investigation, those investigation process are pretty much standardized. The feeding of the data are pretty much standardized. It allows a lot of room for technology use case. One example to that is network analytics. There's some of the banks already implemented to identify trade fraud, whereby for the account investigations, the network analytics allow the investigator to look at how the clients transact with different bank accounts to identify potential circular fund flow, to identify trade fraud or any money laundering concern. There's also other use case whereby the AML investigations, some of the banks, they implement Gen AI to try to automate the process to collate the information, to analyze the information, and then automatically generate the investigation report. So that actually free up the human investigator. So there's a lot of use case, but probably I'll just stop here.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to understand that there's a difference between your reactive investigations and being a proactive investigation or detection, right? So there are technologies that are in play today that organizations can use to help, like Kona AI, like other tools out there, depending on your industry, that actually take communications and analyze them in real time, so that you can be alerted if there's a questionable activity, a questionable communication, that gives you some insight. And again, if you're then having to be answerable to a regulator, how quickly did you respond to that once you knew that something might be going sideways, or somebody might be doing something that they shouldn't be doing? So, and there's multiple data sources, which takes me back to where I started, is understanding your data, where your data is, how you access it, who the players are that may need to be monitored, that would be in a position to put the organization in hot water, are all critical elements in how you develop your programs and how you develop monitoring solutions.
So, as an expert in digital forensics, I believe, like from my point of view, the application of the new technology has been pretty conservative in the area of digital forensics. We've been using the machine learning or TAR, technology-assisted review, for such a almost right. And then this disappearance of a Gen AI-driven review, which probably appears like a couple of years ago, this can potentially change a lot of things. And this like old business model, but using like so many people, like people-intensive like review, might potentially go away by using the Gen AI. What's your view on that? Anyone?
I could jump into that because this is my day. This is my everyday. This technology is much more rapidly than what we saw with the technology-assisted review, predictive coding, is very quickly changing the landscape of document analysis and review, being able to assess things in a much more effective, efficient way. Lawyers have not been cut out of this process by any stretch of the imagination. The term human in the loop is still very necessary. But what we're seeing is that these technologies are not only expediting the actual review process by factors of 30 to 40% faster, but the flip side of that is we're also seeing cost reductions of anywhere from 40 to 60% as compared to a traditional, just pure, continuous active learning type of review model. So it's significant. It's going to change the landscape for how these things are done. And it's also going to change expectations for how quickly these things can be done.
And can I comment real quick too on this? We saw this at Legal Tech. So if you're thinking about the traditional e-discovery tools that are handling unstructured data, you know, they become their own large language models. And for the audience now, we would probably, if you're talking generative AI, so like instead of traditional Boolean type search in your front end of your, I'm not going to name the names, but your common e-discovery tools, they all of a sudden now, instead of search, it's like a ChatGPT type interface to do it. My problem with it, though, was they are taking advantage of the users and they're expensive. They were charging 10 to 15 cents per doc to load, and then each person paid every time they had to search. But just like I remember there was about 15 years ago when a 10X came out, I was charging $8,000 a gigabyte. Remember when you could charge $8,000? Never. And now it's like $30 or $20 a gigabyte. So like everything, it's going to come down. But that LLM, or the large language model and like ChatGPT interface for just the corpus of data that you're searching, it's pretty cool. But I didn't like the pricing.
Well, I can tell you from a practical perspective, and we can get into a separate ideological debate. But you know, what you're trading is, it's actually based upon some use cases and a lot of case study work that we've been doing. Is, you know, yes, there's what appears to be a significant expense, but the level to which it's reducing what would otherwise be human review component, it's far outweighing the cost of the human review.
And again, I wasn't saying your company.
No.
It was the software.
I get it. I get it
Go
completely.
ahead.
But I think there's really important kind of social and philosophical questions to consider as you go into this territory. Little kept me up more, little excited me and terrified me more than the use of AI for a government-driven investigation. And there's been experiments across the United States with regression analysis and bias from that, where you create gang databases of neighborhoods and you say, okay, who's been arrested and who are their relations and where's the crime? And then what do? Well, you police those areas more. Well, then what happens? You arrest more people in those areas. And then what happens? Your algorithm drives you to that area more. And you can get very myopic, even in basic regression analysis. Those problems can easily exist with generative AI. And as I imagine, the internal investigation and the corporate investigation will mirror to some degree kind of what we were designing and executing within the government. I can tell you I thought a lot about that question. Even at the level of, if we're trying to get signal of a huge amount of resources and we can go back and make sure that signal was correct, right? That was kind of year one of generative AI, like hallucination guarding. But really, why did it take you there and not here? And are you looking at the things that you care about the most? And in a neural network of 80 million different features that are driving a conclusion, that's not an easy thing to ascertain. And so the strategies that we have to go, I think it's still worth it to take the efficiencies of it, but running multiple models, comparing results of those models, having them challenge, having kind of a separate AI guide you in terms of, are you querying the data in the most optimal way, or are there certain biases with the way you query it? The expense of generative AI, to me, isn't in the compute. A lot of people get overcharged. Or it's even in the application. There's a lot of solutions out there that are just like an AWS script that they put like a GUI over that are just charging you tentuple what you should be paying. That's all true. The challenge is designing this in a way that the human remains in command, and that your prosecutorial discretion and your discretion as a chief compliance officer and your discretion as external counsel, that you are doing it knowing the advantages and limitations of the strategy that you are pursuing. All strategies are flawed, but there's ways that you can very thoughtfully mitigate the risks of this while taking advantage of the tremendous capability that it offers.
Okay, so last topic, review and remediation. So Matt, can you tell us about how the technology can be used to test and evaluate the governance or the compliance, and how often the company should do it? It's not like once they do it, they can be happy, but I don't think that's the answer. But how often those evaluations should happen, and how the technology should be used to do that?
I think from a U.S. perspective at the moment, in most cases, your enforcement risk from a U.S. perspective is lower than it was 3 months ago. It just is. Now, if you're designing your risk management program, you're probably not thinking your risks of like a 3-year time horizon, right? You're thinking a lot longer than that. And so you don't want to let go. But at the same time, the kind of short-term need to justify a process is probably marginally less important than it was before. And that creates huge opportunity for the compliance professional. It creates an opportunity for innovation. One of the hardest things for me as a CCO was to know when to not do something, when to remove a process. The instinct is always to add and add and add. And I think just like you can have in the current environment a pullback from what I think of as like a historical golden age of compliance that Vince was talking about, you can have that in your compliance program, and you can add to the point that you're interfering with the process. And one of the metrics I would look at in a program, if you're doing diligence, it can be either too quick or too long. If someone was diligenced in a day, it's probably not anything. If they're diligencing in 6 months, people aren't following the process, they're going around it. So you can have this most beautiful process to figure out who's in your network, but if it takes too long, the humans who want to get things done will avoid it. And so there's a question of how often and when, but I think that question is changing. Because with the advent of new technologies, right, continuous monitoring is now very much available at relatively low cost. So that 3-line of defense of like process and test, and certainly, God forbid, your random sampling, that's obsolete. But I think as you move from that kind of audit testing to continuous monitoring, the next thing would be real-time interception, and then the next thing would be prediction. You see, behind the ECCP, almost every point I have like a level of maturation that I would look for across how a compliance program operates. And that's kind of the, right, no monitoring, audit, continuous monitoring, real-time interception, prediction, right? That's your scheme. And that's where you are in terms of how I would evaluate the maturation of like a program. So to me, your question almost implies like, where are you in that spectrum? Are you here? Where it's possible to be here quite often in a very data-rich environment. Now, we're wrapping up in a second, so I would also say, well, the storytelling that you need to do to sell your program has changed. It's not a US regulatory enforcement prerogative for most of you. I do think critically, as you move, compliance has the opportunity to drive efficiency. And there's an opportunity to get rid of a lot of the burdensome parts of compliance that people don't like, because technology offers a way to drive transparency in a way that we can rethink compliance. And compliance is no less important. In fact, to me, it's more important now than it was 3 months ago, even though the influence of risk is low. And if not anything, I want to leave you from my perspective with this before I hear from you gentlemen. And that's the number one selling point to my board when I wanted to do compliance was never regulatory risk or fine. It was talent. Because talent wants a meritocracy. And it's impossible to have a meritocracy without rules and ethics. And the more you get away from the rules and ethics, the less meritocratic your business became, and you start to lose talent. And so to me, the war for compliance and the battle for compliance resources is a battle for talent. And the opportunity to unleash that talent lies within the smart use of technology to manage that risk in the environment that we're in.
Last word? Probably the last comment of somebody.
To me, that finding the right data to assess the risk is key, because it's where you anchor your compliance program and where you measure any improvement or address your progress over the journey.
My last thought is this, and I think this got touched on in the panel earlier today too, is while the U.S. policy is shifting away from less enforcement against U.S. companies, greater enforcement against foreign companies, from the CCOs and general counsels and practitioners in this space that I've spoken with, one of the big concerns is this now going to be the new trade war landscape, where regulators are going to, foreign regulators are now going to target U.S. companies in retribution for U.S. companies targeting foreign companies, U.S. regulators targeting the foreign companies. So I think it's going to be an interesting time to, over the next 6 months to a year to see how this all plays out.
I would say have fun. Compliance can be fun, and ask questions. What worked 5-10 years ago probably doesn't work now and can be replaced for a much more cost-effective and better solution.
Okay, that comes to the end of the session. Thanks so much.